The wind across the high plains of Wyoming does not just blow, it carves. It searches for any weakness in a man's spirit or his architecture, and it pries until something snaps. By late October, the golden grass of the valley had turned to a brittle, frozen gray, and the sky held the heavy, bruised purple of a coming storm that promised to stay for 6 months. In the middle of this unforgiving landscape stood Marcus Henderson, a man of 52 years with skin like cured leather and eyes that seemed to be looking at something 3 feet beneath the frost line. He wasn't looking at the horizon like the other ranchers, he was looking at the dirt. More specifically, he was looking at the 20,000 glass bottles he had spent the last 2 years collecting from every recycling center, tavern, and roadside ditch between Cheyenne and Casper. His neighbors called it the glass grave. They would pull their heavy Ford pickups to the edge of his fence line, leaning out of windows with the heaters running full blast, watching Marcus dig. Old Miller, who had run cattle on the neighboring 3,000 acres for decades, was the most vocal. He watched as Marcus meticulously cleaned a brown beer bottle and stacked it into a trench. "What are you planting there?" Henderson, Miller shouted over the roar of the wind. "You think if you bury enough of those, a brewery is going to sprout up in the spring. You're digging a hole for your own ambition, son. It's a waste of a good south-facing slope." Marcus didn't look up. He didn't offer a witty rebuttal or a frustrated sigh. He simply placed the bottle and checked his level. He could have explained the physics of trapped air. He could have detailed the specific thermal properties of silica glass when encased in a high-density earthen matrix. He could have shown them the sketches he had labored over for 300 nights by the light of a kerosene lamp. But he didn't. He knew that in this part of the country, words were like summer rain, they evaporated before they hit the ground. Only results had the weight to stay. The mockery wasn't limited to Miller. At the local feed store, the talk was always the same. They spoke of Marcus as a man who had let the isolation of the high desert get to his head. They remembered him as a capable engineer who had come back to his family's failing homestead after years in the city, but they decided he must have left his common sense in the smog of Chicago. Sarah, who ran the post office, would shake her head when Marcus came in to pick up his technical journals on thermodynamics and permaculture. "You're going to break your back for a dream that's going to shatter the first time the ground heaves, Marcus," she told him. "Glass and frost don't mix. It's basic math." Marcus lived in a small, weathered cabin that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. His motivation wasn't born of a desire to be different, but from a memory of his grandfather's struggle. He remembered the winter of 1978, when the supply lines were cut off by 10-foot drifts and the only thing they had to eat for 3 weeks was salted pork and withered potatoes. He remembered the look of defeat on the old man's face as he stared at a frozen garden that could provide nothing for half the year. Marcus had decided then, even as a boy, that the earth was a battery. It held heat, but only if you knew how to insulate the connection. His research had taken him deep into the history of the Willipony underground greenhouses of the Andes, but he knew the Wyoming climate was a different beast. He needed more than just depth. He needed a thermal break that wouldn't degrade in the moist soil. He spent months calculating the R value of various materials before settling on the most abundant, most discarded resource available, the glass bottle. A sealed glass bottle is a perfect pocket of dead air. Multiply that by 20,000 and you have a subterranean jacket that the cold cannot penetrate. The planning process was an exercise in obsession. Marcus mapped the sun's path with a transit, marking the exact angle of the winter solstice. To grow tomatoes and peppers when the outside air was 30 degrees below zero, he needed the roof to be at a precise 35-degree angle to capture every possible photon of the low-hanging sun. He calculated the weight of the potential snow load, knowing he needed a structure that could support 5 tons of white powder without buckling. He wasn't just building a garden, he was building a life support system. Construction began in the spring, as soon as the ground was soft enough to take a spade. Marcus didn't use a backhoe. He wanted to feel the soil, to understand the layers of clay and silt that would be his allies. He dug a pit 20 feet wide and 40 feet long, descending 6 feet into the dark, cool earth. Every shovel full of dirt was a testament to his belief that the modern way of farming fighting the climate with expensive fuel and fragile plastics was a losing game. He chose the hard path of integration. The neighbors watched as the hole grew. They saw him bring in loads of sand and lime. They watched him create a foundation of packed stone for drainage. But the real confusion started when the bottles began to go in. Marcus wasn't just throwing them in the pit. He was laying them like bricks using a mixture of clay, sand, and a small amount of Portland cement to create thick, insulated walls. Each bottle was placed horizontally, neck facing inward, creating a honeycomb of air pockets. By the second month of construction, the technical challenges began to mount. A heavy rain in June threatened to collapse the unreinforced eastern wall. Marcus spent 48 hours straight in the mud, driving cedar pylons and hand-plastering the breach. His hands were a map of cuts and calluses. His back ached with a dull, constant throb that reminded him of his age. He could have quit then. He could have filled the hole back in and admitted that the old-timers were right. He could have sold the land and moved back to a climate that didn't try to kill him every morning. But he didn't. He developed a system for sorting the glass. The amber bottles, which absorbed more heat, were placed on the northern wall to act as a heat sink. The clear bottles were used for the upper layers to allow light to refract through the structure during the early morning hours. He was painting with light and physics, but to the passers-by, he was just a man playing with trash. By August, the walls were 4 feet thick. They were massive, silent, and strangely beautiful, with the circular bottoms of the bottles creating a shimmering mosaic of browns, greens, and clears. Marcus began the work on the ventilation system. He buried 4-inch PVC pipes 10 feet deep, extending them 50 feet out into the field. This was his geothermal intake. Even in the dead of winter, the air 10 feet down stayed a constant 50 degrees. By pulling that air into the greenhouse, he would provide a natural heater that required no electricity, no propane, and no luck. One afternoon, Miller stopped his truck again. He looked at the pipes sticking out of the ground like periscopes. "What are you doing now, Henderson?" "Trying to talk to the prairie dogs. You've got more pipe in the ground than an oil company, and still not a single head of lettuce to show for it. My boy is moving to California next week. Says there's no future in fighting this weather. You'd be wise to follow him before you bury any more of your savings in that pit." Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow with a grimy sleeve. "The future isn't in leaving Miller," he said, his voice raspy from the dust. "The future is in staying and figuring out how to actually live here. It's not about fighting the weather. It's about ignoring it." Miller just spat out his tobacco and put the truck in gear. "Some people have to learn the hard way that you can't ignore a Wyoming winter," he muttered. As the build progressed into the late summer, Marcus focused on the roof. This was the most expensive and critical component. He used triple-walled polycarbonate panels, specifically chosen for their high insulation value and their ability to withstand the literal pounding of hailstones. He framed it with salvaged heavy timber, thick beams of Douglas fir that he had reclaimed from an old barn collapse 3 counties over. He notched the beams by hand, ensuring a fit so tight that even the howling wind wouldn't find a gap to whistle through. He spent his evenings in the half-finished structure, watching the way the light changed. Even without the roof fully sealed, the temperature inside the pit remained a steady, cool 60 degrees while the afternoon sun baked the surface at 90. He began to bring in his soil mix, a rich, dark blend of composted manure, peat moss, and vermiculite. He wasn't using the native soil for the beds. He was creating an environment where the roots would never know they were in a desert. September brought the first frost, a light dusting that turned the pumpkins in the neighboring fields to mush. But inside the glass grave, the air was still. Marcus planted his first trial crop, a row of hardy kales, some spinach, and, most ambitiously, 3 varieties of heirloom tomatoes. He knew the neighbors were waiting for the first real cold snap to see his glass walls shatter under the pressure of the expanding frozen earth. They were waiting for the failure that would justify their own struggles with the land. Marcus didn't care about justification, he cared about the thermometer. He installed digital sensors at various depths in the walls and the floor linked to a small battery-powered monitor. He watched as the thermal mass of the bottles began to charge. During the day, the bottles would soak up the solar energy, and at night, they would slowly release it back into the space. It was a slow-motion heartbeat of energy. By early October, the structure was complete. From the surface, it looked like a low-profile glass wedge emerging from a mound of earth. Most of the structure was hidden, protected by the very ground that usually killed everything in its path. Marcus had moved his bed into a small insulated corner of the greenhouse. He wanted to be there for every shift in the atmosphere. He wanted to hear the way the structure breathed. The community's skepticism had turned from vocal mockery to a sort of grim silence. They watched him from a distance now, seeing the faint glow of his lantern through the glass panels in the early evening. They saw him hauling buckets of water, still convinced he was merely delaying the inevitable. The first real test was coming. The weather reports were starting to whisper about a pressure system dropping down from the Arctic, a mass of air so cold it was being described as a once-in-a-century event. Marcus checked his seals. He checked his intake pipes. He could have felt fear. He could have doubted the math that he had checked 1,000 times. He could have moved back into his cabin and kept the wood stove roaring, but he didn't. He sat in the center of his glass and earth sanctuary, surrounded by the smell of damp soil and the sight of green leaves, waiting for the world to turn white. He knew that the bottles held more than just air. They held the heat of 1,000 summer hours, and it was finally time to see if that was enough. As the temperature began its long, steady slide toward zero, the rest of the valley scrambled. Miller was out in the wind, trying to move his cattle toward the lower draws, his face turning a dangerous shade of blue. Sarah was boarding up the post office windows, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The hardware store sold out of heaters, insulation, and hope in a matter of hours. The crisis wasn't just coming, it was already leaning against the door. Inside the greenhouse, the temperature was a balmy 72 degrees. Marcus sat in his shirt sleeves, watching a ladybug crawl across the leaf of a tomato plant. Outside, the wind had reached a 60-mile-per-hour scream, carrying with it a fine, biting snow that reduced visibility to nothing. The bottles in the walls were doing their job, the dead air within them acting as a barrier that the freezing wind couldn't bridge. He checked his monitor. Outside -15 degrees Celsius, inside +22 degrees Celsius, the delta was growing, and with it, the proof of his life's work. The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a terrifying, absolute silence. It was the kind of cold that seemed to freeze time itself, a crystalline stillness that made the air feel like it was made of jagged shards of diamond. By midnight, the mercury had plummeted past -20 degrees Celsius, and by the time the sun failed to appear behind the thick, leaden curtains of the sky the next morning, it had bottomed out at a staggering -30 degrees Celsius. This wasn't just weather, it was a biological ultimatum. In the town of Bittersweet, the pipes in the old municipal building burst with a sound like pistol shots. Car engines became blocks of useless iron. Their fluids turned to the consistency of molasses. The very moisture in a man's breath would crystallize before it left his lips, falling to the ground as a fine, white powder. Marcus Henderson stood in the center of his creation, the glass grave, and felt a sensation that was entirely foreign to a Wyoming winter, the warmth of humidity. While the world outside was being stripped of its life by the sub-zero gale, Marcus was surrounded by the heavy, sweet scent of damp earth and the chlorophyll-rich breath of thriving plants. He checked the digital readout of his sensors. The exterior temperature was a lethal -31 degrees Celsius. The temperature of the soil 3 feet down was a steady 18 degrees Celsius. The ambient air within the greenhouse, buffered by the 20,000 bottles of trapped air and the geothermal heat rising from the deep earth intake, hovered at a comfortable 21 degrees Celsius. It was a miracle of physics masquerading as a hole in the ground. The technical brilliance of the bottle walls was now fully evident. As the sun's weak winter rays hit the southern-facing glass roof, the light was captured and reflected into the earth-sheltered walls. The air inside each bottle acted as a thermal break, preventing the intense cold of the surrounding frozen soil from leaching the heat out of the interior. Simultaneously, the dark soil and the amber-colored glass absorbed the solar radiation during the few hours of daylight, storing it like a battery. This was the latent heat Marcus had gambled his reputation on. He watched as a bead of condensation rolled down the leaf of a Brandywine tomato plant. Outside, the world was dying. In here, life was accelerating. He could have felt smug. He could have walked to the edge of his property and waved a fresh tomato at the passing snowplows, assuming any were even moving. He could have called Miller on the shortwave radio just to describe the taste of a fresh spinach salad, but he didn't. He spent his time meticulously pruning, checking the moisture levels, and ensuring that the heavy snow accumulation on the roof was cleared every hour. If the snow sat too long, it would act as an insulator, yes, but it would also block the vital light his plants needed to maintain their internal sugars. He used a long-handled wooden rake to clear the panels, the wind outside clawing at his heavy coat for the 3 minutes he spent on the surface before retreating back into the safety of the earth. By the third day of the deep freeze, the crisis in the valley had reached a breaking point. The power lines, weighed down by ice and whipped by 70-mile-per-hour gusts, had finally snapped, leaving the entire county in a dark, freezing vacuum. For the ranchers, this was a catastrophe. Without power, the automated waterers for the cattle froze solid. Without heat, the stored hay became brittle and lost its nutritional value. More importantly, the fresh food supplies at the local market were gone and the roads were impassable. People were huddling around wood stoves, eating canned beans, and watching their breath fog the air inside their own living rooms. The first visitor arrived on the 4th day. It was Miller's son, David, a man in his 30s who had always been more reasonable than his father. He arrived on a snowmobile, his face frost-bitten and his eyes wide with exhaustion. He didn't come to mock, he came because his father's pride had finally broken along with the furnace. David climbed down into the entryway of the greenhouse, a small airlock Marcus had designed to prevent heat loss. When the second door opened and the wall of warm, moist air hit the young man, he collapsed onto his knees. He stayed there for a long time, just breathing, his lungs expanding in the kind of air he hadn't felt in months. "Is this real?" David whispered, looking at the rows of vibrant green kale and the ripening peppers. "My dad said you were building a tomb. He said the glass would crush under the frost. But it's warmer in here than it is in our kitchen. We've been burning the furniture just to keep the pipes from exploding, and you've got gardenias blooming." Marcus didn't say much. He handed David a heavy basket. "Fill it," he said. "Take the kale, the spinach, and the winter radishes. There's enough for your family and the Andersons down the road. Tell your father the glass didn't break. Tell him it's holding the sun." The word spread, not through the mail or the internet, which were both dead, but through the oldest network in the world, one neighbor helping another. Over the next week, a steady stream of snowmobiles and snowshoers made their way to the Henderson place. They came skeptical and they left transformed. They saw a man who had been ridiculed as a fool standing in a cathedral of recycled glass, producing food that shouldn't exist in that latitude. Marcus became the de facto pantry of the valley. He wasn't just providing calories, he was providing proof that the old ways of fighting the land were obsolete. One of the most profound moments occurred when Sarah, the postmaster, arrived. She had been the one to tell him that math and glass didn't mix. She stood in the center of the structure, her hands trembling as she touched the rough, mosaic surface of the bottle walls. She looked at the technical monitors Marcus had installed, seeing the minus 33 degrees Celsius outside and the plus 22 degrees Celsius inside. She realized then that Marcus hadn't been eccentric, he had been prophetic. "You weren't building this for you, were you, Marcus?" She asked. "You knew this storm was coming." "Not this specific one," Marcus replied, "but I knew the vulnerability we lived in. I knew that relying on a wire to keep us warm and a truck to keep us fed was a fragile way to exist. I just wanted to build something that didn't need permission from the power company to stay alive." The validation was measured in more than just degrees. It was measured in the health of the community. While other towns in the region reported cases of scurvy and severe malnutrition during the 6-week blockage, Bittersweet had fresh greens. Marcus taught the local children how to pollinate the tomato blossoms by hand, their small fingers dusty with yellow pollen while the blizzard screamed outside the glass. He showed the men how the geothermal pipes worked, explaining the simple elegance of using the Earth's own core temperature to survive. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a hungry, desperate desire to learn. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to refine the system even further. He noticed that the blue glass bottles he had placed in the corners were less effective at heat retention than the amber ones, but they provided a specific spectrum of light that seemed to encourage the growth of medicinal herbs. He began a logbook, a thick ledger where he recorded every temperature fluctuation, every growth rate, and every observation. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was a scientist in a laboratory made of trash. He experimented with a small pond at the far end of the greenhouse, using the thermal mass of the water to further stabilize the nighttime temperatures. Within that pond, he introduced tilapia, creating a closed-loop aquaponics system that provided protein as well as vegetables. The turning point for the valley's philosophy came when the state officials finally cleared the main highway and reached Bittersweet. They expected to find a disaster zone. They expected to find a population broken by the elements. Instead, they found a community that had gathered at the Henderson farm. They found people who were healthy, well-fed, and, most surprisingly, inspired. The regional agricultural representative, a man with a degree from a prestigious university, stood in Marcus's greenhouse for 3 hours, silent. He looked at the bottle walls, the hand-dug trenches, and the thriving tropical plants. "This shouldn't work according to the standard models," the official said. "The R-value of a glass bottle is theoretically too low for this kind of delta." Marcus smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "The models forget about the Earth," he said. "They forget that the ground is a mother that wants to keep her children warm. You just have to know how to ask." The legacy of the glass grave began that very winter. It started with Miller. The old man, once Marcus's harshest critic, spent his recovery time sitting in the greenhouse, watching the plants grow. He didn't apologize in words, that wasn't his way, but he showed up one morning with a heavy spade and started digging a pit on his own south-facing slope. He asked Marcus for the measurements. He asked about the angle of the roof. He asked where he could find 10,000 bottles. Within a year, 3 more Henderson houses, as they came to be called, were under construction in the valley. Marcus didn't patent his design. He didn't keep his findings in a locked safe. He held weekend workshops, teaching anyone who would listen how to calculate the solar gain of their specific plot of land. He explained the importance of the 35-degree roof angle and the necessity of the geothermal intake pipes. He believed that knowledge, like the heat in his walls, was only useful if it was shared. He saw his innovation not as a way to get rich, but as a way to decouple his community from the fragility of the modern world. The long-term impact on the region was staggering. Bittersweet became known as the Green Valley of the North. Even in the harshest winters, the town was self-sufficient. They no longer feared the snapping of a power line or the closing of a mountain pass. They had built a new kind of security, one that was literally rooted in the earth. The glass grave had become a monument to resilience. Visitors from all over the country came to see the man who grew tomatoes in a blizzard. They saw a quiet, silver-haired man who still spent his days with his hands in the dirt, still checking his levels, still looking for ways to improve. The philosophical reflection that Marcus often shared with those visitors was simple. He would tell them that the greatest mistake of modern man was the belief that we have conquered nature. We haven't conquered it. He would say we've just built a very expensive, very fragile wall against it. Innovation isn't about building a bigger wall. It's about learning to live within the rhythm of the world as it is. It's about realizing that what we call trash is often just a resource we're too proud to use. Those 20,000 bottles were just empty vessels until they were given a purpose. A man is much the same way. The structure itself evolved over the decades. The Douglas fir beams aged to a deep, rich bronze, and the glass bottles took on a patina of history. Marcus added a solar-powered pump for the aquaponics and expanded the subterranean footprint to include a root cellar that could store 10 tons of potatoes. But the core of the project remained unchanged: the earth, the glass, and the trapped air. It was a testament to the idea that the most profound solutions are often the simplest, and the most ridiculed ideas are often the ones that save us in the end. As Marcus reached his later years, he could often be found sitting in a hand-carved cedar chair in the warmest corner of the greenhouse, a book in his lap and a fresh peach in his hand while the Wyoming wind rattled the window panes. He had seen the valley change. He had seen his neighbors go from skeptics to disciples. He had seen his own children and grandchildren grow up with a different understanding of what it meant to be a farmer. They didn't see the winter as an enemy to be endured. They saw it as a season of quiet growth, a time when the earth gathered its strength. He could have been a wealthy man if he had sold his designs to the big agricultural firms. He could have left the harsh Wyoming plains for a life of comfort in a milder climate. He could have spent his final years resting on the laurels of his success. But he didn't. He stayed in the dirt. He stayed in the pit. He stayed where the work was because he knew that the true value of a man's life isn't found in what he accumulates, but in what he builds that outlasts him. The glass grave wasn't just a greenhouse. It was a promise kept to a grandfather who had once stared at a frozen garden with tears in his eyes. It was a bridge between the scarcity of the past and the abundance of a sustainable future. The story of Marcus Henderson and his 20,000 bottles became a legend in the High Plains, a tale told to every new generation of homesteaders who thought the land was too tough to tame. It was a story of a man who looked at a pile of trash and saw a harvest, a man who looked at a frozen wasteland and saw a garden. And every winter, when the temperature drops to -30 degrees Celsius and the wind begins to carve the landscape into jagged white peaks, the people of Bittersweet look toward the Henderson place. They see the soft, warm glow of the glass roof, a beacon of green in a world of white, and they remember that the only thing stronger than a Wyoming winter is the quiet, persistent imagination of a man who refuses to believe that anything is impossible. The transition from being a local curiosity to a regional savior did not happen overnight, but it was solidified during the long, dark stretch of January when the fuel trucks simply stopped coming. The mountain passes were choked with snow that had turned to solid ice, and the state's budget for plowing had been exhausted by the sheer frequency of the storms. In the town of Bittersweet, people began to count their remaining propane gallons like drops of water in a desert. This was the moment when Marcus's technical foresight moved beyond agriculture and into the realm of survival engineering. He had designed the glass grave to be a closed system, but he realized that no system is truly closed when your neighbors are shivering. He spent the second week of the Great Freeze focusing on the thermal efficiency of his airlock. Every time a neighbor entered to trade labor or supplies for fresh produce, a precious amount of heat escaped. Marcus calculated the loss. For every 30 seconds the outer door remained open at -30 degrees Celsius, the interior temperature dropped by 0 degrees. To counter this, he implemented a strict protocol. He built a secondary staging chamber using heavy, recycled wool-moving blankets and a framework of PVC. Visitors would enter the first chamber, wait for the air to stabilize, and then enter the second. It was a crude but effective airlock that preserved the delicate microclimate he had labored to create. He also began to document the specific performance of the bottle walls with a level of detail that would later become the foundation of his published manuals. He noticed that the amber glass bottles, specifically those that had contained thicker glass at the base, held their heat for approximately 14% longer than the thinner, clear glass bottles. He mapped the entire structure with an infrared thermometer he had scavenged from his days in the city. The results were startling. Even at 3 in the morning, with no solar gain for over 10 hours, the surface of the bottle mosaic walls remained at a consistent 16 degrees Celsius. The earth behind the bottles acted as a massive heat battery, and the glass honeycomb provided the perfect insulation to prevent that battery from draining too quickly into the sub-zero night. During this period, Marcus faced a technical crisis that nearly compromised the entire project. The geothermal intake pipes, buried 10 feet deep, began to suffer from hoar frost accumulation. Because the air inside the greenhouse was so humid compared to the dry, frozen air outside, the moisture began to crystallize at the mouth of the intake vents. Within 48 hours, the airflow had been reduced by half. Marcus watched the CO2 levels in the greenhouse rise on his monitors. The plants began to show signs of stress. The tomato leaves curled slightly at the edges, a silent plea for oxygen. He could have panicked and tried to force hot air down the pipes with a hair dryer, which likely would have cracked the frozen PVC. He could have opened the main roof vents and sacrificed 20 degrees of heat just to get fresh air. He could have given up and watched the plants suffocate in their own success. But he didn't. Instead, he utilized a simple thermodynamic trick. He used a long, flexible plumbing snake wrapped in a thin layer of copper wire, which he connected to a small 12-volt battery. By creating a low-voltage heating element that he could slide into the pipes, he melted the frost from the inside out, allowing the moisture to drain into the gravel leach field he had built beneath the structure. It was a surgical solution to a systemic problem. As the community became more involved, the glass grave transformed into a sort of communal schoolhouse. On Tuesday afternoons, despite the cold, a small group of local teenagers would trek out on snowshoes. Marcus taught them about the thermal diurnal swing. He showed them how to read the barometric pressure and how to adjust the manual louvers on the southern wall to maximize the stack effect for natural ventilation. He was teaching them that they didn't have to be victims of their environment. He was giving them the tools to see a landscape not as a threat, but as a set of variables that could be managed with enough patience and physics. One of the students, a girl named Maya whose family had lost their entire winter crop of hay to mold, asked Marcus why he didn't use modern insulation like spray foam or fiberglass. Marcus led her to a section of the wall where the bottles were exposed. Spray foam dies, he told her. It off-gases, it degrades, and eventually it turns to dust. But this glass will be here in 500 years. The Earth doesn't need us to invent new materials. It needs us to remember how to use the ones that don't rot. He was teaching her about the eternity of the material, a concept that would later become a cornerstone of his philosophy on sustainable homesteading. The harvest of late January was the most successful in the history of the Henderson farm. Marcus recorded a yield of 85 pounds of tomatoes, 60 pounds of various greens, and nearly 40 pounds of root vegetables, all produced in a space no larger than a standard garage while the outside world was a frozen wasteland. He didn't sell a single ounce. He traded. He traded tomatoes for firewood. He traded spinach for mechanical parts. He traded knowledge for the continued goodwill of a community that had once laughed at him. He was creating a microeconomy of resilience, proving that food security was the ultimate form of currency. The physical toll on Marcus, however, was significant. Maintaining the structure at minus 30 degrees Celsius required constant vigilance. He slept in 4-hour increments, waking up to check the sensors and clear the roof. His hands were perpetually stained with the dark, rich compost of his beds, and his eyes were bloodshot from the dry Wyoming wind that greeted him every time he stepped outside to clear the solar panels. He could have hired help. There were plenty of men in town who owed him favors. He could have automated the venting system with expensive sensors and actuators. He could have moved his operation to a more temperate climate where the stakes weren't so high, but he didn't. He believed that a steward must be present to hear the language of the soil, a quiet communication that no machine could ever replicate. By mid-February, the Great Freeze began to break, but the challenges didn't end. The Big Melt brought its own set of problems. As the 4 feet of snow on the surrounding plains began to turn to water, the glass grave faced the threat of flooding. The frozen ground acted like concrete, sending millions of gallons of runoff toward the lowest point on the property, Marcus's greenhouse. This was the final test of his drainage engineering. He had installed a French drain system made of 4-inch perforated pipe wrapped in landscape fabric, buried in a trench of 2-inch river rock. He watched with a bated breath as the water began to pool around the exterior of the structure. If the seal on the glass bottles failed, or if the hydrostatic pressure of the saturated soil became too great, the walls would cave in, crushing months of work and thousands of plants in a single, muddy instant. He stood in the center of the pit, listening. He didn't hear the groan of shifting earth. He didn't see the dreaded weeping of moisture through the mortar. Instead, he heard the steady, rhythmic gurgle of the drainage system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The water was being diverted around the structure and deposited into a lower catchment basin he had dug 50 yards away. The glass grave remained as dry as a desert bone. The success of the drainage system was the final piece of evidence the town needed. It wasn't just about heat, it was about structural integrity. When the roads finally cleared and the first supply trucks reached Bittersweet, the driver was shocked to see a line of people outside the Henderson place, not waiting for handouts but carrying crates of fresh, green produce to their cars. The Henderson method had officially moved from an experiment to a proven standard. In the years that followed, Marcus's life changed. He was no longer the crazy man with the bottles. He became a consultant, though he hated the word. He traveled to the high deserts of Nevada, the frozen tundras of Montana, and even as far as the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. In each location, he adapted the design. In Nevada, he used clear bottles and deeper trenches to provide cooling during the 45 degrees Celsius summers. In the humid East, he focused on massive ventilation and charcoal-based filtration systems to prevent mold. He was proving that the principle of trapped air and Earth mass was a universal law of survival. He wrote a series of manifestos that were distributed through the remaining independent seed saver networks. He spoke of the tyranny of the grid and the freedom of the pit. He argued that true independence wasn't about having a lot of money. It was about having a system that the world couldn't take away from you. He became a hero to a new generation of Americans who were tired of the fragility of modern life. They saw in Marcus a man who had looked at the worst the world had to throw at him and replied with a garden. The legacy of the 20,000 bottles also had an environmental impact that Marcus hadn't fully anticipated. By the time he was 65, the town of Bittersweet had diverted over 100 tons of glass from the landfill. Every time someone finished a bottle of soda or a jar of pickles, they didn't throw it away. They washed it and brought it to the glass bank at the edge of town. The community was literally building its future out of its past consumption. The landscape was no longer dotted with trash, but with the shimmering, subterranean roofs of new greenhouses. Marcus's philosophy on sharing knowledge became his most enduring contribution. He often said that a secret is a form of rot. If you have a way to feed your neighbor and you keep it to yourself, you're just waiting for them to become your enemy when they get hungry. By teaching everyone his methods, he had ensured his own safety and the stability of the entire valley. He had replaced the competition of scarcity with the collaboration of abundance. As he entered his twilight years, Marcus began to experiment with the aesthetic side of the glass grave. He started using colored glass to create intricate patterns in the wall's images of sunbursts, stalks of wheat, and the rugged skyline of the Wind River Range. The greenhouse became not just a machine for living, but a work of art. On bright winter mornings, the interior would be bathed in a kaleidoscope of light, a stained glass cathedral dedicated to the humblest of gods, the soil and the sun. He could have retired and let the younger generation take over the heavy lifting. He could have spent his days in a comfortable chair by the fire in his cabin. He could have stopped learning and simply repeated the same lessons until he died, but he didn't. He was always tinkering. His final project was a gravity-fed thermal siphon that used the weight of cold air to pull heat from a compost pile directly into the floor of the greenhouse. He was 90 years old when he finally perfected the design, completing the circle of waste to energy that had defined his life. The day Marcus Henderson passed away, it was minus 35 degrees Celsius and bittersweet. The wind was howling and the snow was horizontal. But inside the original glass grave, the temperature was a steady 22 degrees Celsius, the tomatoes were ripening, the kale was crisp, and the ladybugs were busy patrolling the leaves. There was no mourning in the valley that day, only a profound sense of gratitude. The people didn't gather at a church, they gathered in their own greenhouses, surrounded by the warmth of the earth and the shimmer of the bottle walls. They remembered the lesson he had taught them through 30 years of action, that innovation is not the product of a lab, but the product of a need. They remember that the earth is not a hostile force to be conquered, but a partner to be understood. And as the sun set over the frozen Wyoming plains, the hundreds of glass roofs across the valley began to glow, reflecting the last of the light like 1,000 tiny suns buried in the dirt. Marcus was gone, but his vision had become the very fabric of the land. He had turned a glass grave into a cradle of life, and in doing so, he had ensured that his community would never be cold or hungry again. The profound lesson of his life remained. Greatness is often found in the things others discard, and the most revolutionary thing a man can do is to plant a seed in the dark and have the patience to wait for the light. Innovation is the quietest form of rebellion, and in the frozen heart of the American West, Marcus Henderson had led a revolution that would grow forever. The success of the winter harvest had transformed Marcus's property into a living laboratory, but for Marcus, the glass grave was still a prototype. He knew that if he could grow kale and tomatoes, he could push the boundaries of what was possible in a Zone 3 climate. By the following spring, he began what the locals called the citrus gamble. In a land where the only fruit that usually survived were hardy apples and bitter chokecherries, Marcus intended to grow Meyer lemons and blood oranges. This required an even more sophisticated understanding of microclimates and a radical redesign of the greenhouse's internal humidity controls. He could have imported expensive climate control computers from the Netherlands. He could have installed a network of electric humidifiers and dehumidifiers powered by a noisy diesel generator. He could have admitted that citrus was a luxury meant for Florida or California. But he didn't. He looked instead to the way the earth itself managed moisture. He spent 3 weeks digging a secondary trench system beneath his main walking paths, filling them with a specific grade of porous volcanic rock he had shipped in from a dormant vent in Idaho. This wasn't just for drainage, it was a passive humidity lung. When the interior of the greenhouse became too dry during the intense, sun-drenched days of February, Marcus would flood the rock trenches with a few inches of water. The heat stored in the bottle walls would cause the water to evaporate slowly, rising through the rocks and providing the 60% humidity that the citrus trees craved. When the humidity became too high, the cool surface of the rocks would cause the moisture to condense and return to the water table. It was a self-regulating system that cost nothing but the sweat of his brow to install. The technical specifications of the citrus gamble were precise. To fruit, the lemons needed a minimum of 6 hours of intense light and a temperature that never dipped below 12 degrees Celsius, even at the roots. Marcus adjusted the angle of his interior reflectors, large sheets of reclaimed plywood painted with a specific mixture of white lime and crushed mica. These reflectors were positioned to bounce the low winter sun directly into the dark corners of the pit, ensuring that the understory of the greenhouse received the same energy as the canopy. The community watched with bated breath when the first white blossoms appeared on the lemon trees in the middle of a March blizzard. The scent was intoxicating, a sharp, sweet, tropical fragrance that drifted up through the ventilation pipes and into the frozen Wyoming air. It was a smell that didn't belong in the high plains, a smell that spoke of possibility and the defiance of geography. Miller, who had become Marcus's unofficial foreman, would often sit on a bucket near the citrus trees just to breathe. "It's like a different planet down here. Henderson," he would say. "You've built a piece of the Mediterranean under a foot of snow." But the citrus gamble brought new pests. In the closed environment of the glass grave, aphids and spider mites found a paradise. Without the natural predators of the outdoors, they began to multiply at an alarming rate, threatening to strip the lemon trees of their vitality. Marcus could have used industrial pesticides. He could have sprayed the interior with chemicals that would have lingered in the soil for a decade. He could have cleared the entire greenhouse and started over, but he didn't. He researched the life cycles of beneficial insects and commissioned a specialized shipment of ladybugs and lacewings. However, the challenge was keeping the predators alive during the nights when the temperatures outside were lethal. He built insect hotels into the bottle wall's small cavities where he left the necks of the bottles open and stuffed them with dried hollow reeds. This provided a thermal refuge for the ladybugs, allowing them to retreat into the warm earth mass of the walls when the sun went down. Within 2 weeks, the aphid population had collapsed and the ecology of the greenhouse had reached a new, stable equilibrium. The expansion of the Henderson method began to attract attention from further afield. A group of architectural students from the university traveled 5 hours through a sleet storm to map the structure. They were fascinated by the glass-earth interface. They measured the density of the bottle mortar and found that Marcus had accidentally created a material with a higher thermal resistance than many modern composites. The combination of the air pockets in the glass and the high clay content of the mortar created a delayed heat release of approximately 8 hours. This meant that the peak heat collected at noon was being radiated back into the greenhouse at 8 o'clock at night, exactly when the plants needed it most to survive the first plunge of darkness. Marcus shared his notes freely, but he warned the students that the math was secondary to the observation. "You can calculate the R value all day," he told them, pointing to a sensor. "But if you don't feel the air against your skin, you'll miss the moment the system starts to struggle." A greenhouse is a living lung. If you treat it like a machine, it will eventually break like one. He was teaching them a new form of empirical homesteading, where the data was always subservient to the lived experience of the farmer. One of the most significant technical innovations of this period was the fungal heat sink. Marcus realized that the composting process, specifically the breakdown of wood chips and manure, produced a significant amount of heat as a byproduct. He began to build raised beds that were actually hotbeds with a 2-foot layer of fresh organic matter buried beneath the topsoil. As the fungi and bacteria worked to decompose the material, they raised the soil temperature by an additional 10 to 15 degrees. This allowed him to plant heat-loving crops like sweet potatoes and even small batches of ginger. He was layering his heat sources. The sun provided the top-down energy, the bottle walls provided the side-wall insulation, the geothermal pipes provided the baseline air temperature, and the fungal decomposition provided the bottom-up root warmth. It was a 4-dimensional approach to thermal management. By the 3rd year of the citrus experiment, the lemon trees were producing 50 pounds of fruit per season. The bittersweet lemon became a symbol of the town's resilience. Local restaurants, the few that had survived the economic downturn, began to feature Marcus's produce on their menus. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the story. People would travel from 2 counties over just to have a salad that was grown in a hole in the ground while the outside temperature was minus 25 degrees Celsius, but with fame came new pressures. A large-scale agricultural corporation sent a representative to the Henderson farm. He wore a suit that was too thin for the Wyoming wind and carried a tablet filled with projections. He offered Marcus a significant sum for the patent rights to the bottle wall design. He spoke of modular underground systems and scalable subterranean units that could be sold to the wealthy in the suburbs. Marcus could have signed the contract. He could have moved to a mansion in Jackson Hole and never dug another trench in his life. He could have retired in comfort and let the corporation turn his innovation into a luxury product, but he didn't. He looked at the representative in the eye and told him that you can't patent the Earth and you shouldn't patent survival. The design stays in the public domain, Marcus said. If a man wants to build this, he should only need a shovel, a pile of bottles, and the willingness to work. If you turn this into a product, you take away the very thing that makes it work, the connection between the person and the soil. The representative left frustrated, but the word of Marcus's refusal spread. It solidified his status not just as an innovator, but as a guardian of the common good. The glass grave was no longer just a building, it was a philosophy. It was the idea that the most important technologies should be the most accessible ones. The technical manual Marcus was writing grew to over 500 pages. He included chapters on soil microbiomics, enclosed systems, the physics of refractive light in subsurface structures, and the sociology of food independence. He documented the failures with as much detail as the successes. He wrote about the time the white fly infestation almost claimed the peppers and how he had to invent a yellow sticky trap system using discarded plastic and honey. He wrote about the structural crack that appeared in the eastern wall during a minor seismic tremor and how he reinforced it using a woven willow mesh that was then plastered over with lime. As the years progressed, the impact on the local youth was the most profound. A whole generation of children in Bittersweet grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to go down to the garden in the middle of a blizzard. They didn't see winter as a time of death, but as a time of indoor abundance. They learned the names of the minerals in the soil and the gases in the air before they learned the names of celebrities. Marcus started a seed exchange program. Because his greenhouse was a controlled environment, he could grow heirloom varieties that would have cross-pollinated and lost their purity in the open fields. He became the keeper of the genetic memory of the region. He saved seeds for cold, hardy spinach that could survive a brief freeze and deep-rooted tomatoes that could handle the high alkaline water of the Wyoming plains. The legacy of the glass grave also began to take on a spiritual dimension for the community. During the darkest days of the year, usually around the winter solstice, the town would hold a small gathering at the Henderson farm. They would take turns sitting in the warm, green light of the greenhouse, a stark contrast to the blue, freezing twilight of the surface. It was a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life was persistent. It was a place of meditation and hope. Marcus's own philosophy continued to evolve. He began to speak more about the economy of enough. He argued that the goal of farming shouldn't be maximum yield, but maximum stability. If I grow 10,000 tomatoes and they all rot because the road is closed, I have failed, he would say. But if I grow 500 tomatoes and they feed 10 families when they have nothing else, I have succeeded beyond measure. He was challenging the very foundation of industrial agriculture. The structural integrity of the glass grave remained flawless through its first decade. The bottle walls had settled into the earth, becoming a monolithic structure that was almost as strong as the native bedrock. The glass had not shattered, the mortar had not crumbled. In fact, the calcium carbonate in the lime mortar had continued to react with the CO2 in the greenhouse air, a process called carbonation that actually made the walls harder and more durable over time. The building was literally breathing in the waste gas of the plants and turning it into stone. Marcus noted this phenomenon with great excitement. The building is part of the cycle, he wrote in his journal. It's not just housing the plants, it's being strengthened by them. This is the ultimate goal of architecture, a structure that improves the longer it is inhabited. He began to experiment with living mortar, incorporating certain types of mosses and lichens into the exterior seams of the bottles to see if they could provide an additional layer of biological insulation. He could have stopped there. He could have rested on his laurels as the man who conquered the Wyoming winter. He could have let the world come to him, but he didn't. As he approached his late 70s, Marcus began to look at the arid land problem. He wondered if the same principles of the glass grave, the trapped air, and the earth mass could be used to solve the water crisis in the summer. He started the summer cooling expansion. He dug a secondary pit, even deeper than the first, designed to capture the coolth of the night air and store it for the blistering 100-degree days of July. He used the same 20,000-bottle technique, but instead of focusing on solar gain, he focused on evaporative cooling. He built a series of wind catchers modeled after ancient Persian architecture, directing the hot Wyoming wind over the underground water trenches. The results were just as revolutionary as the winter greenhouse. While the surface temperature hit a scorching 38 degrees Celsius, the cool pit stayed a refreshing 18 degrees Celsius. Marcus was now growing cold weather crops like head lettuce and radishes in the middle of a drought-stricken August. He had completed the seasonal cycle of resilience. He had proven that a human being, armed with nothing but trash and an understanding of the earth, could create a stable, productive environment in any extreme. His property became a living encyclopedia of sustainable techniques. There was the glass grave for winter vegetables, the cool pit for summer greens, the geothermal cellar for long-term storage, and the solar still for purify alkaline well water. Every structure was built with the same ethos: use what is discarded, work with the earth, and share what you learn. As Marcus stood on the ridge of his property, looking down at the shimmering mosaic of glass and soil, he realized that he had achieved something more than just a successful farm. He had built a buffer against the uncertainty of the future. He had created a place where the rules of the world, the rules of scarcity, the rules of climate, the rules of the market no longer applied with the same crushing force. He had built a sanctuary of reason in a world that often seemed to have lost its way. The profound lesson he left for the next generation was that the earth is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And the way we live that mystery, whether we fight it with force or join it with wisdom, will determine our survival. Marcus Henderson, the man who buried 20,000 bottles in a Wyoming hillside, had shown that the most radical act of rebellion is simply to live well, regardless of what the weather or the world has to say about it.